Perfect, thank you. All right, so my name is Johannes. Also, people call me Joe if they are not quite sure how to pronounce my name. And before I start, a short disclaimer. So this is actually a talk I'm going to be doing at a conference in a couple of weeks. So please give me any kind of feedback after the talk. Come up to me and say, well, those slides are bad or whatever. And then I try my best to make this into the best monorepo talk ever. Right, so the talk or the title is The Curious Case of Monorepos. And I picked this title because always when I talk about monorepos, there's like this emotional side of things. And there are like some people who have really bought into monorepos, who really love it and want to use it everywhere. And there's like this other fraction who rather have like many repos, so everything in their own single repository. So before I get too much into advantages or disadvantages, I kind of want to set up the field, like what is a monorepo exactly? So I found this definition on Atlassian, which is like in a blog post, which describes really well of what a monorepo is. And so it says it's a repository that contains more than one logical project. So that means, for example, you have a repository, and inside of that repository you have the iOS client, for example, you have the server, you have everything that belongs to a whole project. And those projects are most likely unrelated, loosely connected, or can be connected by any means. So again, like the example of having like a server, like the mobile app, like the web client, or like just modules, just parts of each, just everything in a single repository. So you probably have seen this before, and this phrase of, or maybe you've read the blog post as well, of give it 5 minutes, which means that before you try to critique an idea, just let it sink in. So for me personally, and I'm going a bit into like how I felt when I first saw monorepos, and I didn't quite like them, to be honest. So I really was more into the idea of having like everything in a single repository, like you have on GitHub, like everything in their own decentralized space. And so it took me a while to actually warm up to the idea to monorepos. And I think in a way it's very similar to when you first see React and you see JSX and you're like, ooh, what's this? And so I think monorepo is the same kind of philosophy for that. All right, so let's see like kind of like a project evolving over time. So let's have this chat application. So we have a chat client. So obviously it's a fictitious example, but I worked in a project which kind of like evolved in a similar way. So we have a chat client, which is JavaScript, React, whatever, any kind of framework that you can think of. And then we have a server, which might be Ruby, which might be JavaScript. And so at the beginning, well, this is like the whole project. This is like everything that the business does. But then somebody has the idea, oh, let's bring in another app. Like, might be like a news feed, might be like an iOS app, something like that. So this second app, and unfortunately the arrows are, you can't really see them at that well, unfortunately. But yeah, they're like arrows from the news feed client to the server and from the chat to the server. So obviously the server is powering both of them. And then after a while, you're like, well, so we kind of have like the same UI components. So those UI components are part of the chat client, part of the newsfeed. And then from then, it kind of like starts to explode more and more, because you could say, well, OK, so we have these UI components. We can actually make them even more modular. So we can have like a button. We could have like a label. you could have like all of those small components living in their own repository. Or let's say you have like some utility functions in JavaScript that you use both in the chat client and the newsfeed client, and then this would be its own repository, and then you start to break them up even further and further. And then you're like, oh man, I have like my linting rules. And obviously those have to be the same across all of the repositories. And you split those up, and so on and so forth. So what the monorepo is in itself is actually just a folder that contains all of the projects. I think that's like the most simple thing that you can think that a monorepo does. So it's just a bunch of folders inside of a big repository. So let me walk you through some of the advantages and disadvantages that a monorepo does, because obviously, like everything in technology, there's always like two sides of a coin. So one of the big advantages for me is I always have like a single lint, build, test, and release process. And the example that I brought up just a couple of minutes before is that we can have like an ESLint and like a configuration that lives like on the root level that powers like all of the projects. Like for example, we have like this ESLint configuration, and it's being used throughout all of the projects. But in one of the projects, it is just a bit different because a different team is working on it. And this works very well because we can still extend from the root configuration, but have like specific things different in one of the projects. And the second thing is, similar to the ESLint, is that we also can have we can reuse the same test frameworks that are Mocha, Jest, just live on the root level and then test everything that's needed. So the next thing is that it's easier to set up the development environment. Obviously, it's just a single repository that you need to check out. You have probably just a single or just a bunch of readme file that you need to go through. There's no, oh, first you check out this project, you set everything up, and then you check out the other project, you make sure that it connects really well, and then obviously as things happen in development, documentation gets out of date. And then you try to set up the one thing, but then it's not quite compatible to the other. While when you have everything in just a single repository, it's easier for everything to be up to date because it's less context switching. And so the next thing, which I kind of like, I kind of thought about with the last point is, it's easier to coordinate changes throughout the code base. So one thing that usually happens if you have a lot of repositories, then, or especially like in the example that I brought up earlier, you have this chat app. So you have the client, you have the server, and then something changes, or you have to implement a feature on the client. But then it needs to add something to the server as well. So first you have a pull request on the server, then you have a pull request on the client. And then you need to make sure they're in sync. So first merge in the one on the server, merge in the one on the client, make sure that the build corresponds well, and that you deploy the version for the server and the client at the same time, otherwise things will break. So obviously this is just a small example, but think of it, if you have like a lot of common libraries, a lot of different apps, all of them in their different repositories, and it's getting quite hard to manage. So with that as well, obviously, when you have everything in their own repository, it's harder for code reviews because there's a lot of context which is involved. There's a lot of, oh yeah, check this PR first and this and this and that. And also, usually people specialize more towards different projects if they live in their own repositories. So the next thing that I want to talk about is that, let's say you have this chat app that I laid out. So you have different parts, like the UI component, which are common parts that are being used in both clients or in one or many clients. So if you have that living in their own repository, you have these UI components that you need to release on their own, and then you need to update the individual clients to make sure they always are up to date with what was released on the common code. So with monorepos, and I show this like in a bit on a practical example, you can make it that you actually don't need to go through the release process for the common code, but you can just directly link common code inside of the individual repositories, saving you the hassle to actually having to release stuff and go through the whole release process when you just want to link against the development version of common code. So the next thing, obviously, it's easier to test module, because once you have a change, let's say you have a change in the server and the client, you'll be able to see those changes being testable together, or if you have a change in common code, you will see what kind of changes it all affects. Like, does it affect just one client? Does it affect multiple clients? And so on and so forth. So it's easier to test everything in combination rather than just releasing a module that you don't know which implications it has, and then, well, pray and publish kind of, then see if it works. Right, obviously, nothing has just advantages. So let's go in some of the things that monorepos actually don't do very well. So one of them being, obviously, if you have, especially if you have newcomers to a project, it is quite intimidating if they check out and it's like 50 gigabytes of code and it's like 100 folders, they don't know where to start. And it takes, obviously, a bit longer for them to get into the project, get familiarized with everything. And another issue that I think is something that is not quite solved yet is continuous integration. So it kind of depends, obviously, on what kind of system you're using, but be it Travis CI, Circle CI, or anything else, they are not really made for monorepos. So when you have a continuous integration software and you try to run your code on that, it will run everything in your monorepo, and that's not something you want to do for each build. So, this is actually a bit small. Let's see if I can increase this. Right. All right. So what I usually do, or what I have done in projects before, is that I have a little diff which shows me what are the actual changes, what are the actual changed files on the whole code base. So this gives me a list of files that have changed between the current version and the previous version. And then I walk through all of them, take like the first bit of the folder, and then I know, oh yeah, this is happening in this project. And if it happens in that specific project, then I only build that project. So this works very well if you have projects that are very isolated from each other, but for things that are connected, you have to put in some special if things in place, or something that kind of says, well, so if this project gets built like a common code, it should build everything that depends on it. All right. So there's a quote that I got from the Babel repository, and it's juggling a multi-module project over multiple repositories is like trying to teach a newborn baby how to ride the bike. Sorry. Right. So because, well, obviously, for Babel especially, that turned out into a problem. Babel has like a lot of plugins, a lot of transforms, and so on and so forth. So they couldn't have everything in their own repository. It just became too much to handle. So Sebastian, the creator of Babel, he created a tool called Lerna, which should help working with monorepos. So Lerna is a command line tool that you install with npm or yarn or whatever package manager that you prefer. So after you have installed this, let's take a look at our project that I kind of made before it, which is like, so we have like the chat client, the chat server, the newsfeed, and those UI components. So inside of that, each of them is a JavaScript project, and each of those has its own package.json. So the newsfeed and the chat client, they both have the UI components as a dependency. So when I do Lerna init, this gets you started for a monorepo. So what it does, it creates a Lerna JSON file to make sure that the Lerna command line tool knows that this is a monorepo and that it can work like a monorepo. So after we've done this, the next thing to do is Lerna bootstrap. So what it does is, let's just scroll a bit up to see what it did. So we see that it installed the node modules for everything. And for the things that are common code, it just linked them together. So, and as you can see, like the UI components which we had defined as a dependency in the package.json, it just makes a symlink out of this. And for everything else, so for example, in the UI components, we had said, yeah, it's React as a dependency, so obviously installs everything that's needed for React. Right, so what I told in the beginning that you can think of a monorepo basically as just a bunch of folders inside of a repository. And this is pretty much, Lerna just helps handle that. So what it does, it goes through all of those folders, and then one by one does an npm install or yarn install. And afterwards, it links those dependencies together. So think of it more like a kind of like an npm link, but on a project level. So some of you might have heard of Yarn before. Yarn is a package manager. It's kind of like an alternative to npm. So in the next version, I'm not quite sure if it's actually released yet, in version 0.28, it introduced a new feature called workspaces. So I said before that Lerna goes through all of those folders, installs the node modules all by their own, and then links together the common dependencies inside of a monorepo. So obviously that adds a lot of overhead, because some of the modules that are inside of a specific folder, inside of a specific project, inside of the whole monorepo, are probably being used in other parts as well. So what Yarn Workspaces does is it hoists them up and puts them as like node modules that are being used, that can be used for the whole monorepo, than just for a specific project inside of it. Right. Okay, so yeah, that's basically it. The The slides are not quite up yet, but they will be in a few hours.
Thanks, Johannes. That was brilliant. Has anyone got any questions? Hey, here we go.
So Yarn Workspaces is like 200 down on my to-do list of things to study, so you can jump me a bit further. Does that mean can you effectively use one package JSON, like across every single part of your monorepo?
So one of the things that I did in a previous project, so we started out like similar to the chat example that I brought up, is we started out as having everything in its own repository, and then we had to migrate to a monorepo because it just made more sense for us.
Yeah, I'm 100% bought into that. We worked on an app that had about 250,000 lines of code, and with an API and component libraries, and yeah, I mean, for all the reasons you said, you know, publishing to NPM and it's a nightmare. It's really annoying. So yeah, monorepo 100% here. So yeah, so how exactly does Yarn Workspaces solve that?
Oh yeah, so it is not installed. So it's not activated by default. It's like an experimental flag that you have to put in, and then Workspaces doesn't solve it on its own, I would say. So it just makes sure that if you have common node modules or common modules inside of your folder structure, it just hoists them up so that it will resolve them just on a top level and doesn't have to have the modules inside of each folder.
That's completely like, we don't see that as developers. It's just what it does.
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
Gotcha,
Yeah.
I understand now. Excellent. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just from an API server and client standpoint, since you have everything kind of almost co-located, did you feel you had more integration acceptance tests and less unit tests, like as a result, like over time?
So it depends. To be honest, like at the project we worked on, we had more unit tests and integration tests. It was definitely on our list to do, especially because of the monorepo, because we felt it is easier in a monorepo to make sure that the integration tests run when changes happen. But unfortunately, I left the project before we could actually implement those.
I guess the second part of the question is, I guess the initial scaffold for the project is quite long. Do you feel like it pays off exponentially? I mean, once you've done the initial like hard part, I guess, and then.
Yes. So yeah, I definitely think so. Yeah.
Hi. I can see one of the negatives being if you just wanted to update one of the modules within the monorepo and you needed to update one of the shared libraries. If you wanted to update a UI component that was shared among different modules, but you didn't want to have to update all of the clients, what would be your opinion on this? Would you have to then make the change just in the single module, or yeah?
Yeah, it really depends. So from my personal experience working on different projects with monorepos and non-monorepos, so it turned out for most of the project that we use many repos for, we actually want the case for monorepos that we work on a development version, which is common code, and then everything else that uses that common code should always link against the latest development version. But for your case specifically, I think it makes sense to kind of have like going like both ways, like in the sense of you have both going against the development version if you want to, but you could also publish your package somewhere, and then it would take from that package.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Has anyone got any more Question? Oh, one here.
So what do you think about very large or old projects with a lot of history? For example, when Microsoft moved to Git for Windows, I read that their repository took a couple hours to check out because they started using just one repository, and that's where Git VFS came from.
Yeah, I definitely think it really very much depends on the tooling that you use. And obviously, if you use monorepos for just putting everything in that you have, at some point in time, it will start to become bigger and a bit harder to move. So Facebook, for example, they have a couple of monorepos that they use, and they have like a really good talk about monorepos as well, where they say that they actually moved to Mercurial because at some point they couldn't handle the speed of Git. Like, it was getting very slow for them in their use case. So it really depends on that. Obviously, it's still a lot for them to check out, especially for the first time. But I would say the advantages of having everything in one repository, having less context switching, outweigh the disadvantages of that being a bit slower. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Cheers, Johannes.